Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to continue our discussion of European absolutism and Enlightenment by trying to combine these two concepts together and talk about the rise of enlightened monarchs in Europe, how absolute monarchs started using Enlightenment principles to try to modernize and make their nations more powerful and effective. So, how did they do at it? Let's dive in and see. So, here's our objectives for today. Make sure you understand them clearly, and let's move on. So, we're going to first start by discussing the collapse of the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire was this political union that was created going all the way back to Charlemagne, and had been a source of power in Europe. There hadn't really been any sort of unification in the German-speaking world up to this point, and the Holy Roman Empire had been held by the Habsburg family for a long time, but their power had been significantly decreasing ever since the 30 Years' War and the Treaty of Westphalia. So the Holy Roman Empire has really been declining, and so clearly someone else needs to rise to start taking over power in Central Europe. The power that's going to displace this Holy Roman Empire is Prussia. Prussia is a German-speaking state in sort of the western fringes of what is today Germany. Friedrich Wilhelm is part of the House of Hohenzollern, who's going to control Prussia and later be one of the key forces in the unification of Germany. And Friedrich Wilhelm was a leader of Prussia who was absolutely obsessed with trying to create sort of this perfect army of giant soldiers. For some reason, he was obsessed with really tall soldiers, and so he would travel around Europe trying to find tall people and recruit them to come to Prussia and have kids to theoretically create his awesome regiment of tall soldiers. But despite this, we'll take a moment and pause, he also focused on military training, and so it wasn't just for show that he focused on his military efforts. He did put together a pretty substantial military machine. So pause and answer the questions about this document, and then we'll move forward. All of these military developments led Prussia to develop one of the most effective fighting forces in European history and led to the creation of a strong centralized government. Frederick the Great of Prussia then also took in all these Enlightenment ideas and brought them in, granting religious freedom to his subjects, reducing censorship, establishing educational institutions, bringing in Beccaria's system of justice involving jury trials, and abolishing the use of torture. So he's going to bring in all of these sort of enlightened reforms in order to build Prussia up, and he's going to build a civil service that feeds directly into the military. So he's going to control the power of nobles by making the path to political power in Prussia flow through the military and combining together his bureaucracy and his military leadership. So take a moment and pause to read this piece, and then we'll move on. All of this, again, led Prussia to have the preeminent fighting force in Europe, which is going to really pay off when we get into the whole 7 Years' War, when Prussia is going to prove that their soldiers are pretty substantially better than just about everybody else. As far as military reforms go, he's going to establish a series of ranks, and he's going to be able to subdivide his troops similarly to how the Roman armies worked and were especially effective and versatile back in the Republic days. And so by creating a subdivision of ranks and by giving some measure of autonomy to his commanders, his armies are going to be able to adapt to changing battlefield conditions much more effectively than any of the other modern armies that Europe is going to have, giving Prussia a substantial advantage. As far as his government goes, this is Frederick's political testament, so take a moment, pause, and read. You're going to see all of the sort of Enlightenment ideals in there, so make sure you can clearly answer the questions and can evaluate the extent to which Frederick put Enlightenment ideals into practice. All of this, as we mentioned, was incredibly effective in the 7 Years' War, where Prussia is going to single-handedly crush the forces of Spain, France, Austria, Hungary, and Russia and Sweden. So Prussia, and to a lesser extent Great Britain, although Great Britain is going to mostly put their efforts into their colonies, are going to essentially fight to a standstill all the other major powers of Europe, demonstrating just how far above Prussia was from pretty much everyone else, and how these military advancements would lead Prussia to become one of the preeminent rising powers in Europe. In Russia, the enlightened monarch was Catherine the Great. When we last left Russia, Elizabeth was queen. Well, her son Paul is going to come to the throne, and he's going to marry Catherine. Unfortunately for Russia, Paul was not super interested in governing, and so most of the governing fell to Catherine. She is eventually going to basically sideline and push her husband out of power, and then he's eventually going to die, and she's going to rule in her own right. She's going to establish a series of reforms, and she's going to try to take on the biggest problem that Russia is facing at this point, the fact that all of their peasants are still serfs tied to the land. This makes Russian agriculture extremely inefficient, and this is going to be a constant theme in reform of Russia. We've got to do something about the fact that the peasants have no incentive to work hard. But while she was planning this, a guy who was claimed to be her late husband, Paul, started up a massive rebellion against her called Pugachev's Rebellion. And after putting it down, Catherine's going to decide that, okay, it's too dangerous to give freedom to the serfs, and so then she's going to back significantly off there. And so, although she did push a series of Enlightenment reforms, as you can see here, pause and read and take this in and answer questions, she did some realpolitik and some reforms. She failed to tackle the central question of Russia, which is, what on earth do we do with all these Russian peasants and how inefficient they are? She is, of course, going to, so she's not going to abolish serfdom. She's going to give some charter of rights to nobles, but these rights are not going to be, in general, enforced. And the takeaway is Russia's going to mostly stay the same. So here's her decree on the serfs. Take a moment and pause and answer questions, and then we'll move on. As far as foreign policy, we start seeing the partition of Poland amongst its more powerful neighbors. Poland used to be a major player in Europe, but at this point it's going to be divided up between Prussia, Russia, and Austria in what's called the First Partition of Poland. So Poland is going to start getting chopped up. There's going to be a couple partitions after this until Poland is eventually just going to vanish from our map entirely. Catherine is also going to set it her goal to recapture Constantinople. This had been a constant goal for the Russians to get ports on the Black Sea, which would allow them to access the Mediterranean, in addition to their ports on the Baltic in the north. And in order to do this, we're going to see a series of wars between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. These series of Russo-Turkish wars are going to be fought to really no major conclusion, and we're going to keep having this issue crop up. The other powers of Europe are going to be very wary about Russia taking over the great city of Constantinople, but for many Russians, going all the way up to the collapse of the Romanov dynasty, the goal of capturing the Second Rome is one of their key goals, both to take it back for Christianity, but also to ensure that Russia would get access to the Aegean and eventually the Mediterranean seas. And so a series of Russo-Turkish wars are going to happen that we're going to occasionally have to talk about in here. But just keep in mind, for the most part, neither side is going to get the upper hand, and they're going to be fought to no major conclusion. In Spain, the enlightened monarch Charles III is going to try to reform the government of Spain, and in general, it's not going to work all that well. He's going to bring in a lot of these French systems, of course, because he is connected to the French monarchy, since the Bourbons now control the throne of Spain. So he's going to bring in ministers, he's going to set up intendants, he's going to lessen the trade restrictions in the Americas, and he's going to bring in this new model of control, creating a new class of people called the Peninsulares in the Spanish Americas. Previously, Europeans in the Spanish Americas had controlled all the power, but he's going to give all of the top offices to only Europeans, only Spanish people born in Europe, locking out American-born Europeans from the top jobs in the Spanish Empire. This is going to alienate the criollos and is going to be one of the major catalysts for the discontent leading up to the wars of Spanish-American independence. But it was an enlightened attempt to extend greater control over his American empire. So, Charles III, Spain is not going to come back as a world power, but his actions are going to eventually spark rebellion throughout many parts of his empire. With the Holy Roman Empire collapsing, the state of Austria is going to be one of the larger players going forward. The War of Austrian Independence is whether or not Maria Theresa could ascend to the throne of Austria. Obviously, she's not going to be able to be Holy Roman Empire on account of her being a woman, but you're going to see a massive war in Europe in the 1840s with France and Spain fighting against Maria Theresa and Russia and England fighting for her. Eventually, the War of Austrian Succession is won by the pro-Maria Theresa faction, and she is going to regulate. She is going to help us provide assistance to the serfs, providing greater incentives and improving the economy of Austria. She's going to bring in potatoes. She's going to modernize the army, bring in uniforms, bring in officers, redividing, creating school for soldiers, and creating more ranks, similar to the Prussian form. And she's going to ban torture like basically all these other enlightened monarchs, creating a modern legal system. So the Theresian reforms are going to reform Austria and make it a somewhat great power. And Joseph II, her son, is going to try to carry on all this stuff, but he's going to face a rebellion from nobles who are pushing back at the destruction and the taking away of their privileges, which is going to lead to him rolling back a lot of the reforms and not fully embracing them. So Prussia is going to fully embrace enlightened despotism. Russia is going to attempt to do so, but there's going to be some substantial pushback economically, and we're going to see the same thing in Austria. This all illustrates the limits of what enlightened monarchs can do because they have to continue to appease the powerful people in their country, specifically the nobles, who have a lot of vested interests in a lot of the traditional ways in which things were done. And so for enlightened monarchs, if they're going to keep appeasing these nobles, unless they can find someone to displace them as a power base, they're going to have to keep a lot of things in place, or else they're going to lose the support of these powerful people and face rebellions and pushback. So next time, we'll look at the final outcome of this whole Enlightenment thing, the rebellion of Britain's North American colonies. So until then, thank you for listening.